Hi, so in this screencast fight, we're going to look at the origins of psychology and the work of Willem Wundt. So this is the start of the approaches topic. So first of all, you've got a timeline here that explains how psychology has developed. So this is showing you all the different approaches and the order in which they kind of they happened, just showing you how psychology has developed over time. So you've got Willem Wundt with the first psychology lab kind of in the 1870s. So that is origins of psychology. And then you've got the different approaches coming into play. So next you've got the Freud and the psychodynamic approach. And then you've got Watson and Skinner and their behaviorist approach. And then Rogers and Maslow with humanism. Then you have the cognitive approach, then the biological approach in the 1980s, and then the most recent approach is cognitive neuroscience, which is a combination of the biological and the cognitive approaches. So this shows you how psychology has developed over time and how the different approaches have kind of come into play kind of as psychology has developed and as kind of technologies have developed. So it's useful to know kind of where each approach sits in terms of the timeline, in terms of kind of when research was done on that approach. Now, in terms of psychology, psychology has kind of four aims or four goals. It's to describe what happens, it's to explain why something might happen, to predict future behavior, and then potentially to change behavior. So the kind of goals of psychology as a science to do these four things: to describe what's happening in a certain situation, so observing someone's behavior and then just describing what is happening, to try and explain why that might be happening, so to explain a behavior or a trait or some kind of social issue, to predict what might happen again, to predict what might happen in the future with different people, and then to change behaviors. So to change behaviors so it doesn't occur in the same way as it might do without some kind of intervention. So that's kind of the aims of psychology. Now, psychology is relatively new in terms of a science, and it kind of evolved from philosophy. So you had the work of philosophers like Descartes and John Locke, who gave some ideas that psychology kind of followed on from, and you see a lot of philosophy in kind of the early psychological work. So psychology was kind of evolved as a science from kind of some philosophical work that was done before. And John Locke, the philosopher, looked into a concept called empiricism, which is the idea that everything that we know comes from experiencing that, from kind of sensory experience, and that can be studied. So John Locke's concept of empiricism was very influential in the development of psychology. So you've got Descartes and kind of dualism, you've got John Locke and empiricism, and then you've got the evolutionary work of Darwin, all kind of came together with the emergence of psychology as a separate science. The guy that is credited for the emergence of psychology is Wundt. He is named on the spec, so you need to know his name, you need to know his role in terms of psychology. He published the first psychology textbook in 1873 and opened the first psychology lab. So he wanted to study psychology by looking at the mind and looking at how people are thinking, and to break down people's behaviors into separate elements. And he called this structuralism. So when you're talking about Wundt and you're talking about the origins of psychology, you need to make sure that you mention structuralism. So it's the idea that you're reducing behaviors, you're breaking down complex behaviors into separate parts, into basic elements, and that is structuralism. So Wundt looks at psychology from a reductionist point of view. He's introduced this concept of structuralism. Wundt developed a technique called introspection. That is called that because it means kind of looking into. So Wundt's idea was that participants, his patients, could kind of look into their minds, look into their thoughts and their feelings, and kind of report their own thoughts and report their own feelings, and then reflect and reflect on these feelings once they describe them. So introspection is the technique developed by Wundt, and it's about looking into your mind, reflecting on your thoughts and emotions, and being able to describe them to someone else. So that is introspection. This is another key term that you will need to know when you're talking about Wundt and the origins of psychology. Now, introspection doesn't seem particularly scientific, but it's still a process that's used today in cognitive psychology. There is a technique called thinking aloud, which is used by some cognitive psychologists to gain access into people's minds. Wundt tried to make introspection scientific. He would ask people some questions, or he would present them with an object, and then he would ask them to describe what their thoughts, feelings, emotions were when presented with that object or problem to solve or kind of concept. He would sometimes use a metronome timer in the background and get people to kind of report information back in time with the metronome. He thought it was a fairly scientific approach and a fairly objective way to kind of report information. Introspection relies on kind of non-observable responses. So we can't see what people are thinking. We can't see what people are feeling. We're relying on their own kind of reports of something that we cannot see. Introspection is meant to be objective. It's meant to be non-biased. However, it's very hard to gain that if someone's reporting about their own thoughts and feelings. So data that was produced by introspection tended to be subjective, so it's less reliable. As opposed to the information that came later on in psychology that was much more objective and could be repeated a lot easier. So Wundt is looking at the start of psychology. He's looking at psychology as from a structuralist point of view, so breaking things down into their individual elements. He's using introspection as a way to investigate the mind and to kind of gain insight into what people are thinking and kind of what's happening to them. And he wants to establish psychology as a science, something based on fact. So he's following John Locke's work on empiricism, so where you've got information that's based on observable facts. So that's empiricism. It's the opposite. Having empirical data is the opposite of having anecdotal data, which is data just based on stories or kind of stuff that is not fact. So Wundt wanted to establish psychology as a science using this scientific method, and he argued that there were two basic assumptions of psychology, so two basic principles of psychology. The first thing, that all behavior has a cause. So all behavior is determined by something. Behavior doesn't happen by chance. It's not by luck. Behavior is determined. It is pre-caused by an event. So X will always cause Y. And the second assumption is that if behavior is determined, we should be able to predict future behavior. So if we know that X causes Y, we should be able to predict that Y will occur in certain situations. So these were Wundt's assumptions of psychology and his kind of assumptions of kind of psychology as a science. That behavior is determined. Every behavior has a cause. So that links to structuralism. So you can break down the different causes of behavior and look at them individually. And once we found that cause, then behavior can then be predicted. Wundt followed this scientific method. So it's the idea that we have a question or something we want to investigate. We can then create a hypothesis or prediction of what we think might happen in that situation. We can then kind of design an experiment to test that. We can record some data from the experiment. We can look at the data and then we can use our results to either falsify, so prove wrong something. We can alter our experiment and kind of try again, or we can create kind of a theory based on our observations. So Wundt is trying to use this kind of scientific method, but we need to bear in mind that psychologists aren't always scientific. When we get to the humanistic approach, humanism isn't necessarily scientific. There are some things that psychology tries to measure that cannot be measured scientifically. For example, happiness. If you're investigating happiness, you cannot give people an objective score of how happy they are. You cannot say that you are an 8 in happiness. There are certain concepts, feelings, emotions, situations that cannot be tested in a scientific way. We need to take subjective or personal opinions into account sometimes, and that may or may not be scientific. And then psychology is, if it's a science, it should be able to be proven wrong. It should be falsifiable. There are some aspects of psychology that are falsifiable, so some approaches that you can try to disprove, but there are also some areas of psychology that are not falsifiable. So looking at psychology as a science does kind of have its difficulties. Also, when we think of something as a science, we should be able to have a paradigm, which is a big theory, and we should be able to have paradigm shift. So when all psychologists kind of believe in one thing and then change their mind based on evidence and go and believe in something else. And an issue with psychology is we tend not to have paradigm shifts because all the approaches look at things from different perspectives, and they tend to not all agree when you have kind of big changes in theories. So Wundt is using this scientific method, but if you're evaluating this, there is a question as to whether psychology is true science or whether psychology can always be investigated with a scientific method. This is a scientific cycle that Wundt used, and this is in your book. It's on page 7. So it's just his way of kind of investigating the method. Okay, the next slide shows some examples of exam questions that have been up on past papers on Wundt. The first one is a multiple choice question. Please be wary of multiple choice questions. They are usually more difficult than they seem. So there's a multiple choice question here. You've then got a 3-mark question on discussing Wundt's role in the emergence of psychology as a science, so how he helped psychology develop as a science. The second question is a 4-mark question, and it's a fairly tricky one. It's asking you what the major features of introspection are. So there's 4 marks on kind of what introspection is. This is a question that's not answered particularly well. So in the mark scheme shortly, make sure you kind of pick out the key points from that. You then got an 8-mark question about the emergence of psychology as a science again, and then another multiple choice question. The mark schemes for these follow. So if you want to have a go at the questions, please do so before the mark schemes come up. So that's the first 2 questions. So you've got the multiple choice and Wundt's role in psychology as a science. That second question is a 3-mark question. You could get 3 marks by making 2 of those points from the list at the bottom and just explaining them clearly. You do not need to use all 5 of those points. That's the mark scheme for the question on Millie, which is, I think, the most difficult question on introspection. Look at the mark scheme carefully. Again, it's 4 marks, so 3 of those points are written well. Should be able to get you the 4 marks. Try to use the key terms. So try to use the term structuralism as well in there. It says about breaking thoughts into separate elements, but try to use the term structuralism if you can in your answer to that question. And then that is the answer to the 8-mark question. So with that 8-mark question, 3 of your marks are for AO1. So that's the section that says possible content. So 2 of those bullet points will be fine to get your 3 marks. And then the evaluation points, that's your 5 marks for AO3. Again, 2 of those points should be fine in order to get full marks.